Thanks, everyone. It's great to see more folks dialing in. We have just hit 1 minute past and we do have a fair bit of content to cover today. So we will be kicking off. Welcome. It's great to have so many of you on the call today. Many thanks for carving out time in your afternoon to take a deeper dive into navigating our new WGEA legislation targets, taking a deeper dive and talking through those 5 key risks that we really can't afford to ignore. My name's Louise Rogers. I'm a DEI advisor in the Work 180 team, and I'm joined by the wonderful Gemma Lloyd, our co-founder and CEO, who'll be guiding you through our session today. But before we go any further, I would like to conduct an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the true custodians of the land on which I'm dialing in from and wherever you might be dialing in from today, and pay our respects to Indigenous elders of the past and the present. We know sovereignty has never been ceded and it always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Can also see in our wonderful attendee list that we have some endorsed employers and some people who are new to the world of Work 180, which is wonderful. And I can see a variety of organisations that I know are progressing First Nations inclusion and reconciliation in a variety of ways, including reconciliation action plans, which is really fantastic to see. Now, in terms of who'll be guiding you through our session today, of course, you'll be hearing from myself, our wonderful Gemma Lloyd, our CEO and co-founder. And today we have the wonderful help too of Stacey Quilton, our Chief of Staff, who'll be guiding us through our Q&A a little bit later this afternoon. Now, as always, we want today's space to be supportive and open. We want to come to the conversation with curiosity and respect. We know when we're talking about targets, there can be anxiety. This conversation can be very charged. So let's debunk it. Let's come to the conversation and be open to the many perspectives that we're going to talk through. We also don't want it to be a one-way dialogue. We want you to raise your thoughts, your feelings, your insights, and feel free to put them in the chat throughout today for our dedicated Q&A time at the end of today's session. And ultimately, we also want to keep the conversation flowing. Unfortunately, today is not the end all and be all of target setting. And so this might just be one touch point or one conversation in the ongoing journey of progressing gender equity, progressing inclusion, and setting your targets. So in terms of a bit of structure in what today's conversation is going to look like, we will have a bit of an update from Gemma in behalf of Work 180. We'll also do a quick recap of legislation and some of those critical elements to bear in mind for the rest of the conversation today, before we take a deeper dive into those 5 key risks to note when managing and building meaningful targets. We'll have a bit of a spotlight within this on how we can best champion employee voice before, of course, an opportunity for a Q&A. So again, if you have comments, questions, and insights throughout the content that we cover today, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll make sure we address them in our Q&A section. Now, without further ado, I'd love to pass over to Gemma.
Thanks so much, Louise, and that was a very kind introduction. You are also wonderful. So I'm going to give a quick overview on Work 180 for those of you that don't know us, aren't familiar with what we do. So we've been around for over 10 years progressing gender equity. On the one hand, we have our community-facing part of the platform. This is where employers must meet minimum standards around parental leave and flexible working to join and showcase their brand and what they have to offer out to candidates. And we have over 1.5 million women using that every year. And then on the other side is all about helping employers actually make progress. And that's where we have our DEI assessment, our progress hub, supported by our DEI advisory services. And as you can see here, it's this combined approach that enables us to drive measurable, actionable change. Now, what we hope that you'll take away from the conversation today is the importance of starting early. I'd question how early we are now. It's September, but yes, early for some. The second is bringing everyone on this journey to really lead the way, seeing it as an opportunity and not just a compliance tick box activity. And then the power of collaboration with Work 180. Now, the reason why we chose this topic around the 5 risks is because this is our 3rd live series that we've ran on the WGEA targets. Off the back of each live series, we've had many conversations with people and culture leaders, DEI leaders, executives, and there are some very genuine concerns around how they're going to make sure that these targets are meaningful to the business, aligning with the business strategy, making a difference to the employees, and not just seen as as a compliance tick box activity. So we took all of this feedback, all of these concerns, and we've turned it into what the webinar is today that you're participating in. Now, our approach to supporting employers to lead on gender equity incorporates these areas. So the first is the leadership alignment. So providing DEI leads with the tools and the language and the evidence to secure executive backing and make sure that you're really set up for success. We're really pleased that WGEA has set a realistic 3-year timeline because it acknowledges that meaningful transformation does take time. It's not an overnight change. Our approach is also intersectional. So whilst these targets focus on gender, our methodology spotlight race, disability and caregiving status to make sure that nobody's left behind with these initiatives. And last but not least, and we do cover some of this today, is around the backlash ready support. So proactively preparing organisations with training and messaging that anticipates and effectively addresses internal resistance. I'll hand back over to Louise to give a highlight on the legislation.
Thanks so much, Gemma. So what is our new legislation? Now, we won't spend too long on the what of the new legislation today. And as Gemma mentioned, and some of you may be aware, this is part 3 of our webinar series, and you can check out part 1 and 2 in the series for a much deeper dive into the nuts and bolts of the legislation. And you'll also get access links to these previous webinars in our further resource package, which you'll get later today. But I do want to touch on a few critical elements in terms of what the new legislation is and how that's going to inform the rest of our conversation today. So, off the bat, we know our legislation is coming into effect in 2026, and employers need to set those 3 gender equality targets. And at least one of those targets must be numeric. So, for example, a percentage change. We know that these targets need to be chosen from 6 gender equity indicator areas. So this is from a menu laid out by WGEA. And also we need to continuously report and demonstrate measurable progress. We need to track those targets over the 3-year reporting period, and there will be a public reporting at the end of the reporting period as well. Now, in terms of these 6 key areas, many of these target areas might look familiar to you. And so you're able to choose your targets from a menu of these different options. So those key kind of parent or group focus areas are that gender composition of the workforce and the governing body, sexual harassment and discrimination, equal remuneration, employee consultation, and flexible work and care. And we know that lots of work might already be occurring in some of these different areas. And the new legislation is not trying to punish you, perhaps for already doing work in some of these spaces. It's really to continue to elevate and push and progress this. And we're going to talk through how we can kind of leverage the legislation as a bit of a tool to do so. But that is just a high level, a bit of a bird's eye view of the legislation change, and you'll be, of course, you can refer back to our webinar 1 and 2 for a deeper dive. But I want to make sure we spend a good chunk of time talking through some of these critical risks. And today you'll hear about some of those risks and what those risks mean from Gemma Lloyd from that leadership perspective. And then I'll also be here as your DEI advisor today, which is exciting for me, to talk through some of the solutions and the options to guide you through mitigating and managing some of those risks. So I'll pass the microphone back to Gemma.
Thanks so much, Louise. So the first risk that we're going to talk about is setting an uninformed target. And when we talk about uninformed, it really incorporates 3 key areas. The first is selecting the targets without a data-informed approach. So this is understanding where you sit across areas such as pay gap, representation, even understanding your current state of policies and benefits and how they compare to other employers. The second piece is around employee voice. So it must be driven from the employees. Otherwise, it can very much feel like that tick box activity. So Louise will go into more detail about how you can go about that when we go into the solutions. And the third is around understanding leadership accountabilities and responsibilities. So if the targets are set without understanding how leadership plays into really driving these targets, for example, what does the cadence look like that these targets are going to be checked in on? What are the warning points where we say, hey, we're off target here? Well, what is the escalation path? What are the correction periods? And having that solid action plan can be a significant risk if you set the wrong types of targets. So that's the bad. Louise, take us into the solution.
Thanks so much, Gemma. So yes, it might sound like we're not reinventing the wheel here, but assessing your current situation thoroughly is absolutely critical, especially at this juncture where we are time-wise in the year. So off the bat, we want to make sure we have a really robust understanding of your organizational context. So what is our existing strategy? Do we have existing targets? What structures are we following right now? And actually, why are we doing what we're doing? Are there different areas where we are knocking it out of the park? Are there different areas where we think we actually need to be quite critical and focus more on to progress change? It's a great opportunity to assess the lay of the land and look quite critically at what we're doing. One of the tools that Work 180 also has to support this is our DEI benchmarking assessment, which can assess you against 10 key inclusion areas and provide a bit of that bird's eye view in terms of different focus areas that may be missed, or seeing how different areas are interconnected and how we can optimize that to progress change. Now, it's also really critical that we are defining our why behind progressing inclusion. And this might look different at your organization. We know your approach, the way you do business, what is our organizational strategy. All of this will inform our why and what inclusion really means at our business. Making sure we're verbalizing this and making this really clear is critical. And we'll also talk a little bit about how we can communicate that and the value of communicating that later today. Of course, we also want to champion employee voice. You know, you may already have platforms in place to champion employee voice and capture this, and we'll talk through a little bit more about what this can look like in further detail in the next 2 slides. But in terms of assessing your current situation, again, it sounds simple, but many of us may have assumptions. We may have a view of a snippet of data, but not the whole picture. And being able to take that holistic view, that strategic view, can be incredibly valuable. And we've got a note from Andrew Baker from Woolworths Group on the right, who we've been fortunate enough to collaborate with, about how you leveraging tools that enable that bird's eye view, such as a DEI benchmarking assessment, can provide a bit of that structured framework that can showcase those strengths, those opportunities that inform a authentic and meaningful and sustainable roadmap. But that said, I'm going to pass back to you, Gemma, to talk us through a little bit more of those risks around employee voice.
Thank you, Louise. And I will add to what you've stated there around the DEI assessment, because I know there's many endorsed employers on the call here, but for a large portion of the endorsed employers, they're using the DEI assessment when they're going to the board with these particular targets as that data-backed way around why they've chosen particular action targets, in addition to employee voice, which is the segue to the second risk, which is ignoring both employee voice and intersectionality. Through these conversations that we've been having, it has been raised, quite a lot with organisations, that we treat everybody the same here. So why do we need to do this? And whilst this can be very well intended, it does assume that everybody is the same. And we know that's not the case, and people are starting from different starting points. So it's really important to really understand who our employees are and their unique context. The second is that with employee engagement surveys or pulse surveys being conducted without having action taken off the back of those surveys can lose trust. So whilst it might sound appealing to get a pulse check, if the pulse check doesn't come up with follow-up action, it does erode that trust. So these are really key ways. I think it's a really good opportunity with these targets to ensure that these initiatives that you're running around engagement surveys, pulse checks, can actually feed into something really positive and demonstrate the employees that it's being listened to when you select your action target. I've probably gone a little bit into solution there, Louise, but I'll hand over to you to add more colour to that.
We absolutely love it. And yes, talking through what employee voice really means and what intersectionality really means is critical. We know many of you may have heard these terms before, and there's almost an element here that is a bit buzzwordy, but let's break it down. And it is really important to also break it down in your organizational context. So off the bat, when we do talk about intersectionality, this refers to thinking about some of those barriers and enablers that maybe influence how we move through, experience, and are perceived in the world, including in the workplace. And that can be influenced by many of the many things that make us us, including demographic factors such as, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, disability. There's many different things that influence how we move through the world, including the workplace. And so when we think about intersectionality, we think about that lived experience. And when we talk about an employee-led approach, we're really thinking about giving employees a platform to be heard. And as Gemma said, really being active in hearing them. And we know this can be facilitated in a multifaceted way, such as a pulse survey, a consultative group, a focus group, and making sure that there's actually action off the back of gathering this experience, gathering this data is really critical because they're incredibly valuable insights. We can also marry them up with a variety of other data points that you may capture day to day in your organization. Now, when we're breaking down those buzzwords, we're facilitating that meaningful employee engagement. But you may have also heard the term nothing about us without us, also going around and leveraged in a variety of communities. Ultimately, this really means that we know we cannot create something for our community without our community. And so referencing our quote on the right-hand side from Neha from Box Hill Institute, it's not just about ticking those diversity boxes. It's about understanding how those things shape the way people experience work and making sure that we create space for that. So are we actually giving the time and the resource to understand the experience of our employees, what they need and what they want, and how that will influence our target setting, how we can best progress gender equity and inclusion in a way that is meaningful and sustainable in your world. And that may well look very different to other different types of organizations, which is incredibly normal. But I'll pass that mic back to Gemma to talk us through our next risk.
Wonderful. Thanks, Louise. So now we've got our data-driven approach. We've leveraged our employee voice. We've got an intersectional lens across everything. So we're really good to go with setting these targets. But the next risk is not mitigating backlash and resistance or preempting that there still may be backlash and resistance. So where this could be a problem is if the why isn't communicated or the benefits. And if it's really put down to being a compliance tick box activity, it's more likely to have backlash. Not building awareness and understanding across the organization, particularly at that leadership level. So all of the leaders need to be well equipped to handle questions from their teams that come off the back of having these targets, and everybody needs to be talking from the same playbook when it comes to these. And then, of course, not taking the data-informed approach to help mitigate or reduce any misinformation about what's happening with the organisation. Take us through the solution for that, Louise.
Thank you. So we have an opportunity here, especially even in this juncture where we are time-wise, to be on the front foot and be prepared and mitigate that backlash. Now, we know backlash really comes from disconnection. So defining those objectives, defining that desired impact, and once again, that why behind target setting, why behind inclusion at our organization is really critical. If we've gone through those previous steps, those previous actions we've talked about against those risks, we're taking that employee-led, data-informed approach that makes our actions, our approach more meaningful, more understood, more transparent. And if we leverage some of those tools, we've got a wonderful note from Claire from Austrade on the right. If we use that benchmarking, we're able to share actually the why and the how are we going in a safe and open way. This can lead the path to more meaningful and impactful ways of progressing inclusion, including having these conversations, mitigating that backlash. If we've defined our objectives, we've defined our why, we're also able to articulate the benefits for all. So we know that there can be many different preconceptions about progressing gender equity, and many people are on different parts of the inclusion journey, as it were. But actually, we know that if we're progressing gender equity and we're progressing inclusion, that strives to benefit all, and everyone needs a seat at the table. So being informed and then being able to welcome those conversations is incredibly powerful at mitigating that backlash, reducing that resistance, and bringing everyone on the inclusion journey. And speaking of bringing everyone on the inclusion journey, I appreciate we have gone through a fair bit of content today, many different concepts and activities that you can do. And if you're not sure where to start, or if you're not sure what data you might be capturing, or what other research you can leverage, here are 2 research reports, both facilitated by Work 180, that take a data-informed approach that champion employee voice and focus on workplace experience. So we have our What Women Want report for 2025, and we also have our Bridging Gaps Together report for 2024. And these reports take a deeper dive into both women's and men's experience in the workplace and approach and take on gender equity. And the research trends and findings that are in both of these reports can be really useful, but also those initial conversations about what does inclusion mean for us? What are the trends we're seeing across workplaces? Why is this so critical and important? And maybe what does that look like for my industry? And also, how can I support employees? How can I champion that voice? These two reports can be a great place to start. So I know there can be a lot of noise around what can I do? Where can I start? And there are a lot of data points, both internally and externally to your organization. Recommend take a look at both of these reports. They're at your disposal and they're created within Work 180. And those links have been kindly put in the chat as well if you're interested at checking them out. Also be incredibly useful, especially for conversations with leadership teams or teams that are keen on data. We love analytical and we love data. So another one up your sleeve there. But that said, I'd love to pass to Gemma for one of our final risks.
Thanks, Louise. So the next one, the fourth risk of the 5, is reputational risk. So if we're not setting the right targets, if the targets aren't meaningful to both the business and also to the employees, it can create potentially broader reputational risk out in market, but certainly internal trust by the employees could be impacted and therefore retention as well.
100%. Thanks so much, Gemma, without a doubt. But we know this can be mitigated. So if we're proactive in building that brand awareness, we're proactive in cultivating that employee value proposition, that can be an absolute game changer. So if we are building that EVP and we are taking strategic considerations about our brand and how we are perceived, particularly regarding inclusion, are we having conversations about that at all? And are we taking a strategic approach? Can definitely be a game changer. I know for those on the call who are endorsed employers, are you leveraging that status being an endorsed employer, how that's showcased on a variety of Work 180 platforms, social media, and the value this also holds for candidates coming into the business and building your broader brand perception. And ultimately, this is also an opportunity to talk through and boost employee retention. You know, if we align our words and our actions, that can be incredibly powerful. If we are talking about our strategic approach to inclusion, we're communicating it, and that's a consistent experience when folks come into the business. That's a fantastic, self-perpetuating cycle, a flywheel of sorts. And we know from our research that we've referenced, even if any employer doesn't walk the talk, it can feel condescending and tokenistic. So we're at a real juncture here. It's an incredible opportunity to build that trust, build your brand, build that offering to set both you, your organization, and your employees up for success in terms of progressing inclusion. Now I'll pass back to Gemma for our final risk.
Yes, the final one is, of course, the legislative risk. So if the new legislation is not complied to, there are 2 impacts of that. The first is the public naming and shaming, being listed as being non-compliant. Of course, no board wants to have their organisation listed as non-compliant. And the second is ineligible. I'm so sorry, I cannot say that word, but you might not be able to tender for government contracts. And so there are certain thresholds in which this applies. Louise, you might know more detail around the specific financial threshold, so I'll let you share those before going into the solution.
Yes, of course, no worries at all. So we know that if you are ineligible, you may be unable to tender for government contracts over 80K, and this can look different dependent on your organization. But we know that ultimately the legislation should be a tool. It really is a tool to help you drive change. And when we leverage it alongside the approach that we've outlined today, you've gone through those key actions, those key steps to set you up for success. The legislation can really help us take that extra step. We know that we have goals and we measure success in a variety of ways at organizations, and this is simulating that in the inclusion space. We know that ultimately, from our quote on the right, what does not get measured does not count, and what does not get measured cannot be fixed. I know the quip that often pops up is what is not measured does not get done, but we know ultimately the legislation is really striving to be a tool to enhance the change that you're already trying to reap. And ultimately, it does also support both that internal and external accountability in terms of, we know that many different employees in your organization will have different accountabilities and responsibilities dependent on the targets that you set. And that WGEA, as that governing body, is keeping that accountability in an external way and also in that public, almost naming and shaming way as well. So there's a few elements to this, of course, but ultimately that legislation is a tool to assist you in driving real change. And I know that if you go through some of these activities that we've listed, it really follows our Work 180 roadmap, which strives to set you up for success when we are doing target setting and not only striving to meet those legislative requirements, but facilitate meaningful change that makes sense for your organization. And so if we go through our key steps of assessing your current position, that will help us identify those meaningful targets before you are able to move into the more proactive development of the practical strategies that enact and get us to succeeding in those targets with a lens of continuous monitoring, review, and improvement. And you will be able to hear a little bit more about maybe how to go through this roadmap and some of those key steps. We do have a new WGEA legislation mini-series helping you prepare for your 2026 targets coming out soon. So watch your inboxes for that. But I also appreciate we've thrown a lot of content at you today. And when we're talking about the new legislation, it can be overwhelming to think about. So ultimately, I want to reiterate that when we are progressing inclusion, ultimately we're striving for that progress, not perfection. And here we've got a word from Katie McCartney from Betfair, who we've been fortunate to collaborate with. Though we are not perfect, Work 180 has assisted us in taking great strides in achieving a workplace that we are proud of. So ultimately, we know that what WGEA, what Work 180, and what your organization should be striving for, it's for that progress. And we know there will be lots of change, learning, and hopefully progress over our 3-year reporting cycle and beyond. But we also know that those small steps can have a significant impact over time. And that's what's brought us to this point. Ultimately, we want to continue to progress gender equity, and it will continue to push us to be better and to strive for more equitable workplaces, including through tools like legislation. But even though legislation may feel overwhelming in some of these conversations, there can be many parts to them. We're striving for that progress, not perfection. We don't have to have it, as an organization, all figured out over our 3-year reporting cycle. This might just be the beginning, and that's absolutely okay. There's different supports and guardrails to support you through this process. But with that said, I'd love to pass back to Gemma.
Thanks so much, Louise. And it was a nice way to sort of sum this up, because I know that we've gone through quite a lot of the risks, and it can feel quite daunting. But hopefully, we've helped you to see the positives that you can take out of it and how to really set yourself up for success. But of course, given what we've said, that importance of starting early is incredibly important, because you want to be taking that data-driven approach, that employee-led approach, bringing everybody on the journey, the leadership team, ensuring that they're well equipped to have these conversations around the why and the benefits to the organization. So it's not just seen as a compliance tick box activity. And then, of course, some of the ways in which we can support you along that journey.